But then when you come to the actual development, there is a conversation that happens with the resource consent application about connections to the local infrastructure. And at that time, that's when our utility and asset managers have a conversation about what is needed to ensure your development fits in with the local network. You might be, as a developer or landowner, required to pay for a new road. You might be required to pay for a stormwater treatment thing on your site. Those are all conversations that happen at the resource consent level, because it's very much dependent on the type and scale of your development, and we cannot predict what that might be until each application takes up that opportunity. But we've definitely had the bulk infrastructure readiness conversation with our infrastructure providers, both in brownfields and in greenfields.
Through you, Madam Chair. Yep. I mean, my understanding with the unitary plan is, in many instances, you'll be able to have increased density without necessarily having a resource consent.
No.
Well, as you recall, for the residential
Can I hang on
topic?
a sec? I think we're digging down. So this is the exact process over the next few weeks for councillors who haven't been intimately involved in the unitary plan. This is our chance to go back and get upskilled again, because this is a very good example of where we might have forgotten some of the stuff that has been presented to us. So let's get into that when we go back through some of the detailed workshops on the unitary plan. I've got Councillor Crum. It was either Councillor Crum or Casey? I just thought, no. Councillor Webster? No? Okay, good.
All right.
John.
Time for that quiz. Light relief. Okay, so you would have heard of things like controlled activities, restricted discretionary activities many times before. We call them activity status. So the question is, and it's the first to put your hand up. How many different types of activity class are there in the RMA? So I've given you two. Oh, sorry. Well, okay, first hand up now.
It's what we like to call an open book.
Councillor Walker. Wrong. Wrong.
4.
Wrong.
5 or 6.
Who said 6?
5 or 6.
Councillor Lee, bang on. There are 6 classes of activities, so...
Councillor Lee, we will be
I shall look
passing...
down.
Councillor Lee.
I forgot to
Prohibited,
do immediately.
Well done, Councillor
Well
Lee.
done, Councillor Lee.
Non-compliant.
Sugar-free diet.
You should name them. Yeah, what are they?
Name them.
Prohibited,
Discretionary, non-compliant.
non-compliant. Can I get a chocolate if I name them?
No, because I'm about to name them. So, just to quickly run through them. Permitted activities, those are activities that your district or regional plan says you do not need a resource consent. Normally, it's subject to meeting certain standards like height controls or whatever it might be, noise levels. That's the permitted activities. Controlled activities, you do require resource consent, but the council can't say no. You have to grant consent. All the council can do is impose conditions on the consent, things like, an example I used before was just restricting the hours the activity can operate from 9 a.m. till 6 p.m. That might be a condition that's placed on the consent, or it might be conditions to deal with how earthworks are undertaken, that sort of thing. And those conditions have to relate to things that you've actually specified in your plan. So quite constrained in that regard. Restricted discretionary activities give council a bit more scope to say no or say yes. So you can grant or refuse consent, and if you grant consent, again, you can put conditions on that consent to manage its effects, but those conditions have to relate to things that you've listed in your plan. Then we move to discretionary activities where, again, council can grant or refuse consent, but the council has much more scope in assessing a discretionary activity than it would for a restricted discretionary activity. You can consider all relevant resource management issues for a discretionary activity. Non-complying activities, there are 2 tests that a development or a proposal would have to pass before the council can even consider it, and the first one is that the adverse effects are no more than minor, and the second one is that the application is not contrary to the objectives and policies of the plan. If you meet those 2 tests, then the council can consider all relevant resource management issues, so it sort of becomes a bit like a discretionary activity at that point, but it's got those 2 hurdles to pass before the council can even consider it, and again, council can grant non-complying consents or decline them. And then lastly, we have prohibited activities where your plan specifies certain things as being no possibility of even applying for consent. It's just not possible.
Except under the SHA Act.
Yeah, HASHA has
No such thing as prohibited. Even if prohibited, it's
Yeah.
not prohibited, which is kind of
Luckily,
weird,
we
isn't it?
haven't gone there. No nuclear power stations.
I don't think you apply for those under HASHA.
All right, so just a couple of pointers in terms of, well, first of all, the difference between this restricted discretionary versus discretionary. So this comes up time and time again. So for restricted discretionary activity status, I mean, we would generally say that that's more appropriate when we're quite clear what the potential impacts of a proposal might be. For example, we know that the only likely impacts are going to be noise. So you wouldn't really generally go for a full discretionary activity status if the only issue that you're going to be looking at is the noise impacts or overshadowing. So someone may be building taller than the plan allows, you would tend to make that restricted discretionary if shadowing is the only issue at play. So for full discretionary, that's more where there's a much wider range of potential effects. So there's a lot more unknowns about what an activity might result in, and that's when we would tend to recommend full discretionary rather than restricted discretionary. And I think the panel's issued some guidance in that respect too, that once you're getting a full, long list of things that your restricted discretionary is going to look at, you're going to look at noise, shadowing, traffic effects, contamination issues, air quality issues. If you're doing a long list like that, we would generally take a stock take and say, well, actually, we're really dealing with a discretionary activity here, not a restricted discretionary activity. Right, so how does the unitary plan use this suite of the 5 different types of activity status? Very few controlled activities. I guess the planning profession has generally found that there are some difficulties in using controlled activities to deal with potential effects of development. So we've got very few of those in the unitary plan, but there are a handful. Restricted to discretionary activity status tends to be used for infringing some of the controls, like the side yard controls, that sort of thing, where we know, what the effects are likely to be. And restricted discretionary activity status is also used where we want to call an application in to look at its design quality. We would use restricted discretionary, so that's the general approach in the unitary plan. We also have some prohibited activities, a whole suite of non-complying activities and permitted activities, but those are just some pointers in terms of what we've done with controlled, very few of them, restricted discretionary for those minor infringements of controls, and restricted discretionary where we want to look at the design quality issues. Any questions on activity status?
Why are you giving these to us? Let's keep it real simple. Why are we going through this?
Well, it's all back to when we get the recommendations on 22 July, you're as informed as possible about the discussions we'll be having, really, that when we as planners start talking about activity status, you know exactly what we're talking about. That's the key reason, really.
I think, Mr Mayor, that goes to the point that you raised earlier. Not everyone here
That's why I'm
are
asking the question.
accredited RMA commissioners, and not everyone has gone. I mean, who's gone through the training?
Who's up to date is the other thing too.
And I've lapsed. I'm doing my retraining. So there are people
Who's
who
got a
are
5-year degree?
Yeah, and so I think it doesn't hurt. Exactly. So it doesn't hurt to go back and just remind people what these are. Otherwise, we presume everyone understands and is intimately clear about what a non-complying activity is. Truth is, not everyone is. So there's nothing wrong with layering up the info. Councillor Watson.
Yeah, thank you. Just in light of the importance of the design criteria that's been quite heavily emphasised throughout this process, how that's going to address all the things. Are we going to have a session exactly on what those design criteria are for different typologies of building?
Your agenda, page 14, you'll see we're coming to you on residential. So anything to do with housing, residential is on the 8th of June, and we'll be talking about how we design issues there.
And that's
And
high-rise, residential, everything?
Yep, the whole package.
So just
yeah, have a quick squiz at we just went through that earlier, Councillor Watson, so that's just the information meetings that we're going to have. So you'll see that there's a whole suite of refreshers on all of these subjects. Councillor Lee.
So, of the 6 activities, how many are covered, how many of those of those 6 apply to the unitary plan?
We've used all of them. We've used them all.
I used them all, okay, but I say thank you.
Madam Chair.
We tried to keep the plan simple and get away with using 3 or 4, but when you delve into it, the fact we have a legislation that has all 6, it makes it very hard to just have a plan that only uses 3 or 4 just because the council thinks it's a good idea.
Might as well use the whole toolbox.
Yeah.
Okay, Councillor Cooper.
Madam Chair, just going back to the activity status on page 15, the top one, can you just take me through why you're using fewer controlled activities? Because I'm just thinking about the whole port application for wharf extension. That was a controlled activity. It couldn't be declined. There were conditions imposed, but then it was basically the way it was looked at was overturned. It wasn't wrong, it was just an interpretation when the judge looked at it. So can you just explain to me when you say the difficulty in addressing potential effects of the proposals, is that kind of,
Well,
is that an example of
that is a
that?
classic example
Yeah.
that the council's position in the hearings on
Yeah.
wharfs was that status should be restricted discretionary, not controlled.
Right.
Because there was no ability to decline those wharfs. And you're limited to looking at things like how they're constructed, the type of drilling that takes place, but the fundamental issue of whether or not there should be a wharf of a certain length, you would need a stronger RMA tool, i.e. restricted discretionary or non-complying, to deal with that. And so that was our case at the hearings on wharfs.
That was very true, except there was a clause acknowledging the possibility of special circumstances, and that the council didn't use that special circumstance, and the judge found that there were special circumstances to notify it. Didn't actually decline it,
But it's
just
still-
said it should have been notified.
I think
And nobody wanted to take it further.
We've got notification next.
the problem we've got with controlled is either when you look at them and you impose conditions, you have to ask the question, could they just have been permitted activity with development controls that they had to meet?
Yeah.
Or as John said, actually you do want to be in a situation where you can decline them if they don't meet certain conditions.
Yeah.
So that's one reason. The other reason is the community is very confused about controlled activity resource consents, because as soon as you say a resource consent, they believe it can be declined.
Yeah.
And then we've had a lot of confusion with communities about, but you said it had to go for a resource consent, but you approved it anyway. And it sounds like it's a Clayton's kind of process. So that's why we didn't believe it was a very useful activity to use in most
That'd be something
instances,
to
would rather be.
address and
We either
changes to
tried
the RMA,
to
wouldn't
ensure things were permitted activity, or we shifted them into restricted discretionary.
Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Davey.
Thanks, Chair. So, the Mayor, he put that question, it was really good that that question came out, actually. Why are we dealing with the activity classes? And I can't help but think that we get very absorbed with the pictures, the maps, but we actually don't dovetail those into the words of the plan. And so I wonder, Ms. Pruitt, if you might just want to emphasise the importance of us all understanding the body of words and having to digest that and understanding the activity classes, objectives, policies, rules, all of that, and how that contributes to really understanding what sits on a graphic. Because I think, and I'm guilty of it myself, it's very quick to go to a map, but you can look at the map in isolation of all those words and you will be misreading the map. I wonder if you can just, as you could, just explain the interrelationship and the importance of reading both equally deeply.
We'll get to it a bit later.
I think, I suppose the way to look at it is that in terms of that hierarchy that John has already talked about, you have to look at it as a whole. You can't just look at the application of the zones in a map, because it's not actually the thing that either enables development or allows activities or restricts them is in the rules of the plan. The map's actually only a spatial representation of where they can be. And so some of the conversations we get about that particular zone shouldn't be there because of X, Y, Z, you need to actually understand what the rules do allow or don't allow, but also what might be the controls around that development.